In May 1945, the U.S. Army Court-Martial Office in Naples, Italy, held the damp odor of sea wind trapped in plaster walls and the dry, stale scent of paper that had been handled too many times. Judge Henry Blake shut the last page of the case file, removed his reading glasses, and pressed his fingertips to his brow until the faint ache eased. Another case so clear it was dull. Private Thomas Ellis had left his post after curfew, forced his way into an Army Reserve warehouse near the harbor, and taken 37 tins of powdered milk. He'd been caught with the tins in his hands. A guard had seen him. The warehouse had filed a loss sheet. In the first hours after arrest, Ellis had admitted what he had done. Later, he tried to retreat into a small lie, insisting he had taken only a few cans, as if shrinking the number could shrink the consequences. The record remained neat: witness statements, inventory counts, confession, the clean arc of an act and its consequence. Blake drafted the findings with practiced speed. The act violated the Articles of War. It damaged discipline in a garrison. In an occupied city still trembling under scarcity, it risked a contagious example. He wrote the language that made sentences sound like machinery, deterrence, order, necessity. When he reached the conclusion, his pen paused for no more than a breath. Then he wrote the word he had expected from the beginning: death. In his draft, he described the theft in the language the service preferred: not a hungry act, not a messy human decision, but a breach that weakened the whole structure. He wrote that it endangered property control and garrison security. He wrote that it carried a bad influence in the occupied zone. He wrote that the accused showed no meaningful remorse. Each phrase was familiar, each justified by precedent, and together they made a sentence feel inevitable, as if the paper itself demanded it. Only one final confirmation hearing remained. It was mostly formality, a last procedural latch. After that, the sentence would take effect. A clerk would stamp and file. A command would schedule. The execution detail would perform its duty. The system made space for hesitation only inside narrow corridors of paperwork. Blake pushed the file aside and felt a thread of professional fatigue, but not fear. In the war's last months, keeping order in occupied zones was not a matter of philosophy. It was the condition under which everything else could happen: supply, transport, reconstruction, and the fragile appearance that the conqueror was competent. Military justice was one of the gears that kept that appearance running. Efficiency, clarity, and deterrence were treated as virtues higher than discomfort. Ellis, whether greedy or stupid, had chosen his moment and met the consequences. Blake's job was to make those consequences procedurally proper. Outside, Naples held the harsh brightness of late spring. Far off, the harbor carried the hulking gray outlines of transport ships. The city had survived the bombing and the street fighting. It had survived, too, the sudden vacuum that war left behind. Hunger and disorder still lived in the alleys, and the poor still looked at uniforms with a complicated mix of hope and hate. Yet on the surface there were American jeeps, MPs in white helmets, and storefronts reopening, arranged into a picture of controlled rebuilding. Blake's work helped keep that picture intact. He was gathering his papers to leave when his eyes dropped to the gap beneath the oak door. A plain white envelope lay there, its edges scuffed, as if it had been pushed under the door with impatient fingers. There was no name, no addressee. He frowned and crossed the room. The envelope was light. Inside, a message had been assembled from clipped Italian print, each word cut from a newspaper and pasted in blunt alignment. Honorable Judge, you are completing your task perfectly, taking the blame for thieves. Blake read it once, then again more slowly, as if a second reading might reveal a signature hidden in the margins. There was nothing. He let out a small breath that was almost a laugh. Complaints and threats were common enough that they had become background noise, part of the office's atmosphere, like the smell of ink. Some were angry, some pleading, some theatrical. This one aimed at his pride, and it did so with the confidence of someone who believed he would not check. He dropped the note into the lowest drawer of his desk, among expired briefings and forms no one would ever file, and closed it with a dull click. A door that did not matter. The next day, at almost the same hour, another envelope appeared in almost the same place. This time the note was handwritten on half a sheet of lined paper. The pencil had bitten into the fibers with hurried pressure. Warehouse number 7. Check the May 7th intake records. Did they ever really exist? Warehouse number 7 was where Ellis had been caught. May 7th was a week earlier. The specificity tightened something in Blake's chest. A vague warning could be dismissed as spite. A pointed question about a record was grit in a boot, small, unseen, and impossible to forget once it started rubbing. He held the paper for a long moment, aware of how quiet the office felt around him. The case file on his desk was still thin and clean. It was still the kind of file that could be finished quickly and forgotten. And yet the words "did they ever really exist" kept returning, not as a threat, but as a professional challenge. If the intake record were compromised, then the rest of the file was built on a floor that might not exist. That afternoon he summoned his clerk. "Postpone the final hearing 72 hours, he said evenly. "I want to verify a detail in the evidence chain, absolute accuracy." The clerk blinked, then nodded and wrote it down. In that period, delay itself was a signal, and Blake felt the faint, immediate discomfort of having sent one. He told himself it was simple prudence. Verification was the caution every sentence deserved, nothing more. The pressure did not remain theoretical. The next morning, Colonel Crawford, the theater's deputy judge advocate and Blake's direct superior, happened to meet him in the corridor, as if by coincidence. Crawford's tone was conversational, but his eyes were not. "Henry," Crawford said, "I heard you delayed that deserter who stole powdered milk. No problems, right?" "Routine verification, sir," Blake replied, "ensuring the paperwork is correct." Crawford's hand landed on his shoulder with measured weight. Not a friendly squeeze, not a shove, a reminder of where gravity sat in this building. "Caution is fine," he said. "Everyone's watching. Efficiency matters. Get me the result." A ripple spread beyond the office. The correspondent, Kent, appended a short note to the Allied daily situation brief circulated in Naples. A straightforward theft case had been unexpectedly delayed for unclear reasons. He did not name Blake, but the note was specific enough that anyone with access could identify the matter. The brief made its way through the officers' mess and administrative offices. At lunch, Blake began to feel eyes shift toward him and away again, as if his postponement had turned him into a minor curiosity. If he was going to delay, he needed a justification that was not just private unease. Alone, without alerting anyone, he went to the quartermaster archives and requested early May inbound and outbound logs for warehouse number 7. The records room was dim, the air thick with dust and paper. A gray-haired sergeant produced the books with the wary patience of a man who had learned that officers asked questions for reasons that rarely benefited the enlisted. Blake turned pages until he found the May 7th entry. It was written cleanly: whole powdered milk, 37 tins, sent from an inland transfer depot, received by the warehouse. The receiver line held a blurred stamp. On the surface, it was tidy enough to make him feel foolish. He could almost see the satisfaction of closing the book, returning to his office, and signing the sentence as if the note had never existed. Then his finger paused at a remark written in different ink, small enough to be overlooked. "No independent delivery receipt filed. Entered per master sheet." The original handoff document proving the shipment had arrived was missing. The ledger entry might have been copied from a summary sheet, a clerical echo of someone else's numbers. In a bureaucracy, echoes could become facts if no one demanded the first sound. The question sharpened into something colder. If the milk had never been physically received, what had Ellis stolen? What exactly had the warehouse lost? What if the warehouse's numbers were not evidence but performance? He left the archives with the remark burning in his mind like a small brand. The harbor horns in the distance sounded ordinary, even cheerful, but he felt as if something beneath the surface had shifted. 2 days later, a third note arrived under his apartment door. There was no envelope, only a crumpled scrap torn from a cigarette-packed liner. A crude charcoal arrow marked the paper, and the words were blunt. Children of Hope. Dusk, only look. On the back was a smudged address near the edge of the San Felice district, where the war's damage still sat in piles and the city's order thinned into crowding and rot. Blake read it and felt the same sensation as with the second note, not fear, but a tug toward a specific place, a specific hinge. He wrestled with it all day. His training warned him away from unknown ground, especially when a case was already drawing attention. But the missing receipt had turned his certainty into a question, and questions have a way of refusing to stay in drawers. At dusk, he changed into civilian clothes, put on a plain brown jacket, and drove alone. The streets narrowed into rubble and laundry lines. Broken stone still lay where no one had cleared it. The air carried garbage, cheap smoke, and too many bodies. He parked at the mouth of an alley and walked in, careful to look like a man who belonged nowhere and wanted nothing. At the end of the alley, he saw a peeling sign, Children of Hope Orphanage. The building was 2 stories, unremarkable, made remarkable only by neglect. Most windows were boarded or stuffed with cloth. Light leaked from a few. From inside came a thin infant cry, sharp and broken. Then more, weak and frantic, gathering into a tremulous chorus. The sound cut through the dusk and, unexpectedly, through the professional distance Blake relied on, like armor. He stayed back in the shadow of a collapsed wall. A gaunt nun, in a faded habit, hurried in and out carrying a bundle. Several children sat in the mud by the door, quiet in a way children should not be, watching without playing the way children were supposed to. Their quiet looked less like discipline than exhaustion. Blake did not approach, he did not ask questions. But the sound of crying connected brutally to the sterile words in Ellis's file. 37 tins of powdered milk. In a ledger, it was a number. Here, it was the possibility of a child living another week. The contrast made him understand why the theft had drawn such severe language in the first place. In a military system, food was not just food. It was morale, movement, and control. If supplies could be stolen, then authority could be mocked. Yet standing there, hearing the thin cries, he could not avoid the other truth. When authority failed to feed the powerless searched for food wherever they could. If Ellis had taken powdered milk for this place, the thought flickered. Blake forced it down. Motive did not erase an act. The law did not turn on pity. Yet a colder question followed. If the shipment had never existed, then what lay between an orphanage's hunger and a warehouse's reported loss? It felt like standing at the edge of a pit and realizing that the darkness had depth. On the drive back, Naples's neon and the jazz spilling from bars looked painted on. In his office, Blake returned to the witness list and decided to start at the most basic point. Find the guards, recheck what they claimed to have seen. It was still defensible as verification, still something he could label as diligence rather than rebellion. Through routine channels, he requested an interview with Private Daniels, one of the listed warehouse guards. The reply came quickly. Daniels had been reassigned 2 days earlier to an engineer detachment north of the city, return unknown. Blake requested another guard. The answer was similar, mission requirements unavailable for questioning. 2 key witnesses were removed the moment he began to verify details. That was no accident. The doubt in his mind stopped being a private inconvenience and became an alarm. He could sense a mechanism responding, quietly clearing a path in front of him so he could not step further. For the first time, he wondered whether the anonymous notes were not threats, but warnings from someone with access who wanted him to see the trap before it closed. Kent escalated again. He published a second column with an aggressive headline and a sharper argument that a petty theft case was consuming outsized attention because a judge insisted on repeated checks. He framed procedural rigor as a threat to deterrence, a luxury the occupied zone could not afford. An Italian newspaper translated and reprinted it under a blunter title that asked whether American justice in Naples had become obstruction. In the mess, Blake felt colleagues retreat. Conversations lowered when he sat down. Officers who had once exchanged jokes in the hallway now nodded and kept moving. He became an object lesson in inefficiency, and that lesson traveled faster than any official report. Crawford's next message was not a corridor question. He summoned Blake to his office and shut the door. Crawford stood at the window, looking out at the drill yard, as if the answer were written in marching lines. Headquarters has noticed, Crawford said. This case is no longer just a case, it's a symbol. People are watching. The longer it drags, the more doubts grow and authority erodes. Blake began to mention the missing receipt and the reassigned witnesses. Crawford cut him off with a lifted hand, not angry, simply final. I don't need your details, I need your result. A clear, regulation-compliant result, quickly, enough. For the greater picture, we accept small flaws. Did Ellis steal? Yes, that is enough. Close it out. That is an order, and it is advice. The words were almost gentle. The meaning was not. Blake left with his throat tight. The command was plain. Stop digging. The implication was plainer. His career depended on obedience. The office's authority depended on speed, not on truth that could complicate the picture. Still, he tried one last route outside the chain of command, the way a man tries one last door even when the building is on fire. An old friend in the MPs quietly told him where Daniels's engineer detachment really was. Not far north at all, but a half-abandoned rail yard on the southern outskirts doing trivial sorting work. Blake borrowed a civilian vehicle and drove there during lunch, careful to arrive like a man running an errand and expecting to be bored. The yard was bleak, littered with rusted containers and dead machinery. A few soldiers smoked lazily, their posture saying they had been sent somewhere unimportant for a reason. Blake spotted Daniels leaning in shadow, dazed, alone enough to make Blake's pulse jump. As Blake started to move, a broad man in civilian clothes emerged from a shack. The man's posture was military in every line. He walked straight to Daniels, spoke low, patted Daniels' shoulder, and guided him away. It was not casual friendliness, it was supervision. Blake stopped himself. He understood then that witnesses were being isolated and that his own movement was likely visible. The mechanism was not just paperwork, it was bodies, eyes, and quiet instructions. It could erase people from the record as easily as it could misplace a receipt. Days later, a memorandum copy from the Theater Public Relations Office was accidentally mixed into Blake's routine paperwork. It warned that media focus on judicial delays could damage Allied image and civilian confidence, and it urged units to avoid impressions of inefficiency and internal disorder. It carried a high-level stamp and no signature. It landed like a weight that ended debate. The case had risen beyond law into management, and management did not tolerate personal insistence. The transfer order arrived immediately after. Crawford told Blake that to protect the fairness of the process and prevent further public distraction, the Ellis case would be reassigned to Lieutenant Colonel Morris, a senior judge. Blake would be moved temporarily to backlog appeals, a polite way of putting him in a room where nothing he touched could matter. "This protects you and protects the office," Crawford said, as if he were offering a favor. "Morris will close it out quickly." Blake did not argue. He gathered his private notes and the 3 anonymous messages and locked them in the bottom of his personal file box. Then he watched his clerk remove the official case folder from his desk. The file left his hands, and with it the last lever he had. What remained was the sensation of having been moved aside for being too attentive. Under Morris, the case moved at machine speed. A hearing was set for the next morning. No extra verification, no additional witnesses. Everything proceeded on the existing record. Morris sat rigid on the bench, sharp-eyed, fast, each stage timed like a drill. His questions were clipped, his rulings were clean. The courtroom felt less like a search for truth than an instrument designed to produce a result. Ellis, in wrinkled prison fatigues, looked gray and empty. Asked for his plea, he waited a beat and said almost without voice, "Guilty, Your Honor." It was not a confession of pride or contrition. It was a surrender. The young defense officer assigned at the last moment opened his mouth, then closed it, and offered nothing. He had no time to learn the file, and he likely understood, as everyone did, that fighting the machine only made it grind louder. Blake received no notice, but he knew the hour. In his temporary office, he tried to work and failed. Letters on the page would not become meaning. He listened for distant footsteps and imagined Morris moving toward the final confirmation that would make the death order real. The orphanage's cries returned to him, not as sentiment, but as context. He told himself there was nothing he could do. He also knew he was lying. Then the door cracked open and Blake's clerk slipped inside, face pale with fear and resolve. "Sir," he whispered, "Anderson came to me. The warehouse guard who was transferred to Daniel's friend. He says he can't hold it anymore. He knows the truth and will say it, but only to you. He's downstairs in the storage room hiding, and there's a nun with him from Children of Hope." Blake stood so hard his chair scraped. "Is Morris still in session?" "Yes, sir," the clerk said. "Anderson says if he doesn't speak today, Ellis will be executed." Blake grabbed his coat, shoved his private notes into an inner pocket, and told the clerk, "Keep them unseen. Don't let anyone spot them. I'll be down in 5 minutes." In the storage room, Anderson crouched in a corner, shaking as if with fever. His eyes were wide and unfocused, as if he expected the walls to grow ears. Beside him stood Sister Maria, the gaunt nun Blake had seen at the orphanage. Her face was calm, but her hands were clenched tight at her waist. Under Blake's urgent questions, Anderson forced the story out in fragments that assembled into a mechanism. The senior sergeant who ran warehouse number 7 and a few trusted men had been stealing supplies for months. Powdered milk, chocolate, canned goods. Anything that could be moved could be monetized in a hungry city. The paperwork was kept clean. The physical stock was quietly siphoned away and replaced with numbers that satisfied superiors who preferred summary sheets to messy reality. The May 7th shipment of powdered milk had never reached the warehouse. It had been diverted at the inland transfer depot and sold off privately while still recorded as received in the warehouse master ledger. Ellis had broken into the warehouse looking for food and blundered into a stash of goods kept off the books. In panic, he grabbed what was close, boxes of powdered milk that had already been written off as loss and left unguarded. When the thieves realized he had seen too much, they chose the simplest answer. They pinned on Ellis a neat theft of older, harder-to-sell inventory that had been accumulating as a problem in its own right, and the total was made to match the record. 37 tins. The ledger balanced. A scapegoat existed. The warehouse discrepancy became an internal loss with a convenient culprit. Anderson had overheard the sergeant speaking with a logistics officer. He understood what that meant. Protection above the warehouse level. He was terrified he would be silenced, or worse. He kept quiet until he learned Ellis might die and received an anonymous warning. Only then did he break. Sister Maria spoke next. her voice steady and oddly clear in the stale room. "He brought 3 tins to the orphanage," she said. "He knocked, left them, and ran. The tins were almost empty, but he brought them. The children will take any nourishment they can." She pulled from her bag a washed, dented, powdered milk tin, now empty. It looked pathetic in her hands, but it carried the weight of a fact that did not fit the case file. There was no time for a perfect evidentiary package. There was testimony and one pitiful object against a cover-up that had already moved witnesses and tightened ranks, but it was enough to force a pause, enough to make the machine hesitate before it locked in death. "Come with me," Blake said, and heard how calm his own voice sounded. He did not have time to explain the risk. He did not have time to ask for consent. There was only time to act. He led them out through dim corridors toward the courthouse. At the main stairs, a guard hesitated at Blake's insignia and let them pass. Footsteps echoed up the stairwell. Blake's heart hammered, but his stride steadied. He was not trying to dismantle the institution. He was trying to prevent a sentence from sealing while facts that could change it were still unspoken. The courtroom doors were shut. Inside, Morris's voice carried, flat and precise, as if reading a schedule. "This court confirms procedures comply with regulation, and the evidence is sufficient. The accused, Thomas Ellis, is guilty. Under the Articles of War, the sentence is death. Clerk, record it." Blake took one breath and pushed the heavy door open. The hinges cracked loud in the sudden hush. Heads snapped toward him, the clerk, the MPs, a handful of observing officers. Morris's face tightened into cold anger. "Judge Blake," Morris said, voice controlled and sharp, "you are interfering with this court. You have been relieved of this case." Blake walked forward anyway. Anderson and Sister Maria trembling behind him under the room's stair. He faced the bench and spoke with deliberate volume. "Judge Morris, I have urgent new evidence of systemic framing. It must be heard before final confirmation. It goes to the foundation of the verdict and whether a soldier should be executed." From the defendant's chair, Ellis seemed to wake from a long, drugged stillness. He lifted his head and stared at Blake as if he could not make sense of what he was seeing. The man who had once written his death sentence was now standing in open defiance to delay it. For a heartbeat, Ellis's face held nothing but disbelief. Then his eyes filled, and he blinked hard, ashamed of the tears and unable to stop them. Morris struck the gavel once. "Order! This is contempt." "I am an officer of the United States Army and the original presiding judge," Blake replied. "On the basis of major irregularities and a key witness now present, I request a hearing on new evidence prior to confirmation under the Manual for Military Justice, Article 105. Warehouse records show a missing independent delivery receipt for the alleged May 7th shipment. Key witnesses were reassigned when verification began. This soldier can testify that warehouse leadership diverted the shipment and framed Ellis to conceal their own theft. This nun can testify that Ellis delivered 3 tins to her orphanage. Whispers rolled through the gallery. MPs glanced at one another, uncertain whether to move. Morris had not expected an accusation so concrete, and he had not expected a nun holding an empty tin to appear in front of his bench. For a moment he seemed to measure the room as much as he measured Blake. From the back a voice cut in, "Let him speak." Kent, the correspondent, was there, writing fast. Italian journalists stirred as well, lenses lifting. Their presence changed the air. It turned the courtroom into a stage, and it narrowed Morris's options. Morris understood what the next headline would be if he signed a death confirmation in the face of public allegations and visible witnesses. He also understood, with a judge's instinct for institutional survival, that an ugly delay was now less dangerous than an irrevocable sentence. His jaw worked. Finally he rasped to the clerk, "Record. Due to unverified new allegations, final confirmation is suspended. Remove these individuals. Separate custody. Recess. He rose and left the bench in anger, robe moving like a curtain pulled hard. A recess was not vindication. It was only a delayed decision. But the act mattered. The truth could no longer be smothered in quiet offices. It had been spoken in a courtroom with reporters present, and in that moment the mechanism that erased traces had been forced into light. Blake was held in a side room. Anderson and Sister Maria were separated by nightfall. Kent's dispatch was on its way home, and Italian papers were shaping the powdered milk case into a symbol of occupation, corruption, and judicial abuse. Allied leadership faced a public storm that threatened not just the legal office, but the broader claim of competent rule. An emergency closed-door meeting convened at headquarters. Senior legal officers, logistics leadership, public relations, and an observer from the Army Department. They did not linger on whether Blake's accusation was true. An internal inquiry confirmed enough quickly. The meeting's question was managerial: how to end the crisis with minimal damage while preserving discipline and the appearance of institutional control. They spoke in the careful dialect of command, where a scandal became an incident and theft became irregular handling of material. No one wanted a public accounting that would invite more reporters, more translations, more questions about how many other warehouses ran the same way. The public relations officers cared about tomorrow's headlines. The legal officers cared about keeping the judiciary from looking fractured. The logistics men cared about keeping supply moving without inviting more scrutiny. The observer from the Army Department listened, asked little, and made it clear that the solution needed to look decisive. The solution came in 3 calibrated moves, each designed to quiet a different audience. First, Ellis. The death sentence was formally revoked. The published reason was not innocence, but doubts about the reliability of the existing evidence structure. Discipline was still performed. Ellis was sentenced to 15 years of hard labor, a number heavy enough to reaffirm that theft of military supplies would be punished, and light enough compared to death to be described publicly as a humane correction under special circumstances. The announcement used careful language about independent review, exceptional circumstances, and the need to protect confidence in military justice. Second, the warehouse. The senior sergeant and 2 close associates were removed from their posts and handled internally. The official language cited administrative failure and ledger disorder rather than a public trial for theft. New temporary guidance on supply oversight and ledger verification was issued, enough to show that lessons had been learned. A separate internal memorandum warned commands not to treat the outcome as precedent and not to discuss it as a basis for future challenges. It was accounting, not confession. The institution would clean itself just enough to look responsible and no more. Third, Blake. The assessment praised his early caution and condemned his later conduct. He had pursued verification outside the chain of command, and after reassignment had disrupted a courtroom to make public accusations. Even if his motive was concern for facts, the method was framed as a procedural breach that damaged authority and unity. The conclusion was practical, not moral. He was no longer suitable for frontline judicial duty. He was transferred out of Naples to a logistics archive center in a remote northern Italian town, assigned as archive supervisor. The order thanked him for past service, but it was exile. It ended his career as a military judge without needing to say so. There was no hero's send-off, Blake packed quietly. On the day he left, a fine rain blurred the harbor into gray streaks. No one came to see him off. In the jeep to the station, he looked back once at Naples and then faced forward. He had not been allowed to win. He had been allowed to change by a fraction what the institution could tolerate. Months later, autumn had settled over the north. The archive center occupied an old estate building that always smelled of paper and dust. Blake's days became filing and numbering shelves of obsolete reports no one asked for. He wore civilian clothes as if the uniform had been folded away with his past. The work was quiet in a way that felt at first like punishment and later like anesthesia. He learned to accept that silence without fighting it, because fighting it required an audience and he had none. Days blurred into inventories of inventories, binders of requisitions, schedules of shipments long since unloaded, disciplinary notes from units that no longer existed. Sometimes, late in the day, he would find a reference to Naples in a report and feel a brief, sharp return of the harbor's salt air, only to have it fade back into dust. One afternoon he found a brief notice in a bound volume of old bulletins. The 5th Labor Camp on Sardinia reported that inmate Thomas Ellis had met labor standards for 6 consecutive months, maintained discipline, and been granted a 6-month reduction. That was all. One line buried among routine items as light as a feather and as final as a stamp. Blake closed the volume and went to the tall, narrow window. Outside lay a barren courtyard and distant hills stripped by season. He felt no surge of triumph. The institutional mountain he had pushed against had not moved. At best, he had altered the fall of one small stone, and the mountain had absorbed the impact without changing its shape. Ellis was alive. His term had shortened. That was a life bought at a price the system could tolerate. The orphanage might receive a little more attention, a few more tens, until some other gap opened elsewhere. The warehouse might tighten controls until the next weakness appeared in a different form. And Blake, once a reliable gear, had become dust in an archive, useful only as a warning and as proof that procedure could be enforced against the people who tried to use it too insistently. The system had allowed a tiny correction to protect its larger stability. It had punished the disruption that exposed the flaw, then absorbed the repair into policy and silence. Justice had not sung an anthem. It had merely breathed heavy and compromised and called that survival. Blake stood at the window as dusk settled over the hills. He felt no pride and no regret, only a quiet, stripped calm. The comfort he could name was small and private, that at the decisive moment he had not looked away and let the machine roll on untouched. The dust had settled. The crack he forced open was narrow, but it had been real.